The leaders of the Hamas terrorist organization are worth a staggering $11 billion. And there are worse things. Workers at a UN agency that is funded by the US celebrated when the Israelis were killed on October the 7th. I'm Simon Constable, and this is Constable Confidential. Joining us tonight is Ben Weinthal from Jerusalem. He is a writer for the Fox News and for the New York Post and the Jerusalem Post, and he's a writing fellow at the Middle East Forum. You are a very busy man, Ben. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on your show, Simon.
Let's go with the first one, the $11 billion. That is an awful lot of money for some people who are leading a terror organization. What do we know about this?
Well, it's been, it's part of open source information for years that Hamas has an office in Qatar, in the Persian Gulf country, and that three of its leaders are based in Doha, and they've sort of lived a life of luxury, and in many ways it's sort of a Roman pleasure pit for these three terrorist leaders, while the population, or at least swaths of the population, are struggling to make ends meet. And of course there is some abject poverty, I should say, in Gaza, but it's a mixed bag in Gaza in terms of the living standard situation. But compared to the three leaders who have amassed a fortune of $11 billion and the population, as I said, that's struggling to make ends meet, one sees the disconnect and the sort of fundamental political and economic corruption of the leadership of this terrorist organization.
It seems like a complete disconnect here. Hamas basically saying that they are representing the Palestinians in Gaza. That's what they seem to be saying. And at the same time, them not living there and having all this wealth that could be used to alleviate any hardships. Is that how you see that? And is that how Israel sees it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, most critics of Palestinian power politics view not only Hamas, which is a EU and US designated terrorist organization that controls the Gaza Strip, but also many critics view Hamas's counterpart in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority that rules over that region, also is plagued with this type of corruption. Now, Hamas is obviously in a different league because they're benefiting from one of the wealthiest countries in the world, an Islamist regime in Doha that has, $450 billion, I think, in its wealth fund to play with, and can continue to fund not only the leadership of Hamas in Doha, but also, as we've talked about on your show, Hamas's military and terrorism empire in the Gaza Strip, and help pay for the massacre that took place on October 7th and resulted in the murder of 1,400 people. And now we know there are 242 hostages in the Gaza Strip, many of whom are foreign nationals, British hostages. There are French hostages, and of course, Americans in other countries.
One of the things that's very interesting with your report, which is in the New York Post, is that Qatar is a country that is seen as a friendly, non-NATO country. Now, that is very interesting to me, given everything that you've said. Now, you got a little scoop about a Tennessee congressman. Can you tell us that?
Sure. A freshman congressman from Tennessee, Andy Ogles, a Republican, is going to propose legislation that would strip Qatar of its major non-NATO ally status of the U.S. if Qatar does not evict the Hamas leadership that resides in Doha. So President Biden awarded Qatar a very generous prize in many ways. He said that Qatar is a major non-NATO ally for the United States. But at the same time, critics are now pushing for Qatar to be labeled a state sponsor of terrorism so that Americans can sue Qatar in U.S. courts because of their role in financing Hamas and kidnapping American citizens and murdering American citizens. That is their financing of Hamas. Now, the U.S. would oppose that, the Biden administration, but you can see that there is there are countervailing forces which were non-existent for many years that are now urging that Qatar be labeled a state sponsor of terrorism, but also be stripped of its non-NATO membership.
And that is that like some other principalities in the Middle East? I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, which has a very strong U.S. link to it in terms of defense.
Right, Saudi Arabia is not a major non-NATO ally. Australia is, for example, and countries that were not originally part of the NATO pact that was established after World War II to prevent the spread of Soviet communism and an absorption of Western Europe by the now defunct Soviet Union. But the fact that Qatar state is, as I said, who's also, and Americans forget this, protected and hid the mastermind of the 9/11 terrorism attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's currently being held in Guantanamo Bay in the late 90s, strikes me as a very questionable choice to be awarded this type of a status from NATO. And the other reason I think critics of Qatar's regime want Qatar punished right now is many Israeli counterterrorism experts and also counterterrorism experts in the U.S. argue that Qatar is the gateway to securing the release of the hostages. And enormous pressure should be imposed on Qatar to secure the release of the hostages because in that memorable phrase that I quoted on your program from Yigal Carmon, he argues Qatar is Hamas and Hamas is Qatar. And there is a plausible argument I see from these folks who say, if you put Qatar's regime in a vice and threaten to decouple them from NATO as a non-major ally, if you threaten to move the CENTCOM, America's largest military base, from Qatar to the UAE or Saudi Arabia, that would animate Qatar to secure the release of the 242 hostages because the country is so fragile. Without an American base or American protection, the country is vulnerable to collapse or an attack from one of its neighbors that views it as an adversary and at times an enemy.
Well, we shall see if the Tennessee congressman gets anywhere with that bill. I wish him the best of luck. Separate story you've done, which is fascinating and horrific at the same time. Employees at a US-funded UN agency celebrated the massacre on October the 7th. This is horrific. Celebrating the killing of people is certainly something I can't understand. But tell us more about this. What agency is it? And what is going to be done about this?
Right. The agency is called UNRWA. It's a UN-funded agency, and it's designed solely to take care of so-called refugees from Israel's War of Independence in 1948 after Arab states attacked Israel. Instead of agreeing to a two-state solution at the time, all the major Arab states that are on Israel's borders launched a war against the nascent phase of the rebirth of the Jewish state. And many Palestinians fled, and they fled to other countries, Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. and in the West Bank and Gaza. So the UN created its own agency just to uh, deal with these refugees. But the problem is the agency has, according to many critics, perpetuated the conflict because it has not sought to resettle the refugees in Lebanon and integrate them into their countries, as we've experienced with other refugees after World War II, when Germans who were living in what is now part of the Czech Republic or Poland were ethnic Germans, were forced to flee back to Germany. Germany did not claim that these are refugees who need to be resettled back into a territory in Poland and Czechoslovakia at that time, and carve out a new area that's just for German citizens. But in the Palestinian case, it's a giant anomaly that's created all sorts of problems. And what happened is, once the war started on October 7th, an organization called Impact-SE in London monitored all the Arabic or many of the Arabic social media posts from teachers. UNRWA provides education, provides healthcare. It has all sorts of services that it provides to the Palestinians. And at least 14 teachers celebrated the massacre of 1,400 people in southern Israel.
Let me interrupt it. Isn't it traditional to believe that a lot of teaching is done by the students following the example of the teachers? So if the teachers are celebrating the murder of 1,400 people, won't that be something that the students are learning from those teachers?
Exactly, and that's been an ongoing problem, Simon, for years. In fact, for decades. That not only are many of the teachers who are based in UNRWA schools in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are promoting violent jihadi ideology, terrorism, and lethal anti-Semitism, and also anti-Western ideas in general that are, contrary to the ideas of feminism or LGBTQ rights. But the school curriculum or curricula is, many of the textbooks are contaminated with the worst forms of anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel. So this so-called UN agent, or this UN agency that's supposed to be neutral and free from this type of discrimination, is actually, for many critics, a major part of the problem, and it's impeding some type of peace agreement between the Palestinians and Israelis. And I should note that the study that I reported on, I think it's over 100 pages, also showed, based on a certain amount of methodology, that at least 100 of the UNRWA teachers who graduated, 100 of the students who graduated from UNRWA schools, who are now adults, participated in the terrorism attack against Israel. That is, they received UN educations.
And there is a kicker here that is really quite atrocious, that the US is the biggest funder of the United Nations, and that means a lot of money is coming from the US to support this agency, which is spreading hate among young people. Hate enough for, like you said, 100 of the students who graduated going off to become terrorists. That seems horrific to me. Do you think the funding will be pulled fairly shortly?
I don't. The U.S. currently funds UNRWA since Biden re-entered UNRWA a few years ago, because during the Trump presidency, the Trump administration pulled the plug on UNRWA funding, largely because of the reasons I cited. UNRWA teachers promoted terrorism and lethal anti-Semitism and anti-Western ideology in their classes. And also UNRWA buildings and schools were hosting Hamas terrorists, and there were rocket launch sites found at different UNRWA schools. And there's simply no real quality control. That's what the Trump administration argued, and then Biden rejoined and has pumped at least $1 billion into UNRWA over the last few years. It's the largest amount of aid money that the U.S. government currently provides. And what the U.S. government, the State Department, told me in their response to my press query was, if there are cases of misconduct or, support for Hamas, these contradict the guidelines, and we will insist that UNRWA take action against these bad actors. But at the same time, the Biden administration and the Secretary of State Blinken, who just met with the UNRWA chairperson, have praised the organization's work. So I don't see any effort on the U.S. administration to discontinue funding or limit funding in order to punish UNRWA with a view toward influencing and changing its behavior. Or do I see any changes coming from Germany, which is one of the big funders, or Japan, or any of the other European countries that pump significant dollars into the coffers of UNRWA?
Do you think that will come back to haunt these political leaders in those countries, like you mentioned, the US, UK, Germany, etc.?
It's hard to say. I mean, it certainly, it depends on whether during elections, whether this UNRWA issue becomes a lightning rod issue in terms of criticism from, in this case, President Biden's opponent. And, it could be an election lightning rod issue in the United States. In other countries, my sense is, with the exception of Great Britain, I sense it won't become a lightning rod issue, because many of these countries, there's just a general consensus that we need to keep pumping money into UNRWA because we want to sort of, follow the pro-Palestinian line and not really implement checks and balances or any real sorts of robust accountability into the process. And that, again, this goes back. UNRWA's been around for, we're now talking, over 70 years, I believe. So it's a very embedded institution that seems to be able to insulate itself from any type of real reform.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. Thank you very much. Ben Weinthal, writing for the Jerusalem Post, the New York Post, Fox News, and is a writing fellow at the Middle East Forum. I'm Simon Constable. This is Constable Confidential, and that's it.